Hello everybody, this is Hammer Striker here. Today I've got a Glock 17, this happens to be a Gen 4, chambered in 9mm on the table. And this gun on its own is probably a little less interesting than some of its history. So take a brief moment here and talk about what makes this particular model of Glock particularly interesting. You could consider this to be the gun that started the Polymer Revolution in force. It wasn't the first, and it may or may not, depending on different opinions, been the best. But it's definitely the one that was a true commercial success. This is the one that really kick-started the Polymer Revolution and probably to a lot of extent resulted in where we are today with polymer guns and many of the other things we have today. It started back in the early 80s. It was manufactured by Glock and it was adopted by the Austrian government, primarily for their military. And when you get into the mid to later 80s, Glock brought them over to the United States and really went whole hog with aggressive marketing. They marketed heavily to police agencies, and one of the things that also happened that really helps any kind of gun sales, as you've seen lately, is attempting to ban it. There was a concerted effort to ban this gun because they had the perception that it was all plastic and would be undetectable by airport metal detectors. Now we all know there's the slide, the barrel, the trigger assembly, that's all steel. Any of the metal detectors could have detected it. But we actually have a law that was passed in '88 called the Undetectable Firearms Act that mandates a certain minimum amount of metal be in every gun. And it was all focused around this gun. You can't get better free publicity than that. Then when we got into the later years, into the 90s, when there were attempt to ban high capacity, Glock kind of saw that coming and manufactured a huge quantity. They ran their factories non-stop, built a huge quantity of them to effectively build up a stockpile of grandfathered guns. When the ban did inevitably go into place, Glock aggressively marketed to law enforcement agencies to trade in for newer improved models, go to 40, go to 45, whatever the case may be, and created a flood of now grandfathered pre-ban manufactured guns to really weather that storm and continue selling Glocks almost as if the ban had never occurred. So what we're looking at here is whether you like the Glocks or not and whether the 17 really still is a viable gun. This is the gun really that brought us the beginning of that whole evolution, and now of course multiple companies make them. Even before Glock started, H&K had a polymer gun, but it never became the market success that the Glock 17 did. So what this really does is gives you some interesting background on the gun. Now let's actually talk about it, this particular one in general. And of course we'll start out as always demonstrating that it is clear. Basically what this is a polymer frame, steel slide, steel barrel. Trigger components of course are steel. And there's quite a bit of interchangeability in internal components such as the pins and the trigger components between this and other Glocks of the same basic frame size. The gun is 7.95 inches long, it's 5.43 inches tall, and it's 1.18 inches thick. It's pretty much that full-size service pistol size, but of course in a striker gun. And that does make sense because the target was to replace the revolvers and service pistols that were currently being used by militaries and law enforcement in the time frame this came into existence. It has a 4.48 inch barrel, which is polygonal rifling. So of course it's not a good idea to shoot bare lead in this, but it does increase chamber pressures and gives you a higher potential for accuracy with a varying bullet weights and pressures. It comes with a 17 round magazine, so of course it holds 17 plus 1. The Gen 4, which is this particular one, comes with 3 magazines. Some of the earlier versions came with fewer. And of course, when they released the Gen 18, or the Glock 18, which was effectively a full auto Glock 17, they replaced the ubiquitous fun sticks, replaced the 17 round magazines for it. They 31 round capacity, and of course you can get an assortment of different base plate extenders to add 1 or 2 to that. This one's a +1. And of course the aftermarket loves the Glock. So you can get something like this drum that holds 50 rounds that fits quite nicely in the gun. Now if that doesn't fit in a gangster movie, what does? One of the things that has gotten significant amount of aftermarket support for Glocks is the interchangeability. Other than the slides and things like that fit the particular size gun, a lot of the internal components are interchangeable, connectors and things like that. So it's easy for the aftermarket to make one part that then fits a wide range of guns. One of the other things that Glock has done, that a lot of later manufacturers have picked up on some of this, but Glock was one of the earliest ones to start that, is they had law enforcement discounts. And an individual personal law enforcement could buy a Glock at a discounted rate. Then they founded the GSSF, the Glock Sport Shooting Foundation, which targeted civilians, and they extended the discount to civilians. So Glock has been exceptionally aggressive in marketing these things and basically flooding the market, drawing that attention. When you couple that with their legendary reliability and the consistency as they developed additional models, the operating consistency and the trigger consistency, you end up with pretty much an unstoppable force. So I mentioned the trigger, so let's talk about the trigger. So they were unloaded. They all work about the same, and it really kind of, to some extent, doesn't matter which Glock you pick up. You've got the split trigger, which is part of the drop safety. You've got a minimal amount of take-up, but some take-up, and a relatively short, very crisp, defined break. A very short reset, and when you do reset, you are right on the wall. And again, you have that short break. So you take your reset. Now if you let it all the way out, then you're back out there. Again, your short take up and right on the wall. One of the characteristics of the Glock line in general is their safe action system. And basically all that comes down to is a number of internal safeties that disengage themselves sequentially as you pull the trigger, in addition to the split trigger. So there's no external thumb safety and really no need for one. Kind of the tagline with a Glock is, if you want it to fire, pull the trigger and it will every time. If you don't want it to fire, keep your finger off the trigger and it won't fire. The sights are pretty standard across the entire Glock line. They're a U-dot. They're extremely bright, very easy to see. These are not night sights, these are just standard day sights. But in any amount of regular lighting, they're very easy, very clear, easy to pick up. They are dovetailed, so they can be drift adjusted for windage or replaced. The front sight is pinned, but it's pinned via a screw that comes up from the bottom. So once you have the slide off, I'll show you that when I get it taken apart, you can easily unscrew this and replace it with another sight. And like other things in the Glock line, the aftermarket has taken off, and there's a whole assortment of night sights, day-night sights, fiber optic sights, whatever sight you can dream up, you pretty much make them for the line of Glocks. So the next tip is I'm going to show you how to take it down. They're exceptionally easy to take down. So we'll of course start with clear. You do have to pull the trigger. Then all you do is grab the gun with your thumb around the beaver tail, your fingers across the top of the slide, and then just close your hand. That's all you got to do is just kind of tense your fingers up a little bit. That will take tension off of a little bridge that will then allow you to pull down these two pins right here, and the slide pops right off. So let's take a second and talk about the frame first. The frame is exceptionally simple. It's well constructed and it's really durable, but it's as simple as you can get. You've got steel rails up at the front. You've got a really robust locking block right here that also acts as the pivot block for the barrel. You've got the trigger bar, and this little protrusion is part of the drop safety mechanism. As you pull the trigger and this comes back, it releases a pin that I'll show you in a second that disengages the safeties. And then you've got the sear back here and the steel rails. There's really not much else going on in this frame. It's very light and very solid and well constructed. When you get to the slide, you've got a very simple slide, very few valleys and grooves, so there's really not much activity here. On the Gen 4s you do get a captive guide rod. Some of the earlier models had this as well. You've got your barrel. And it's a nice solid block. The feed ramp is not really polished from the factory, but it is smooth. You can polish them off, but these guns are noted to eat just about anything you want to put in them. especially the 9mm. They just work. But it's a nice, solid, robust, well-machined barrel. And then we get into the slide. The slide's not fancy. There's nothing decorative on it. Everything that's in here just has a purpose, just to make the gun work. But everything that's in here is well done. Everything is deburred, smooth. There's no machining marks. It's just well done. You've got nice, robust guide slots here. Right here is the drop safety I mentioned, right at the end of my thumb. And as you pull the trigger, that will be pressed down and disengaged by the trigger bar. And at the back you have the striker, which also acts as the other part of the sear. This is really all as far apart as you have to take apart for general cleaning. You clean the various parts, lubricate it, and then reassemble it. You drop the barrel back in. And then I did mention this is captive. It's also a dual spring. And this does help quite a bit with recoil management, being able to stage the spring and control recoil throughout the entire cycle. You just drop this back into place. There's a little half moon cut out at the front of the barrel that it slides into, and you just kind of give it a little push, make sure it dropped in place. Then to reassemble it on the slide, all you do is line it up with the guides, slide it back, and you're back in business. So that was one of the other big attractions for this gun at the time. It was unheard of to have that simple of a takedown in an automatic. There weren't pins that you had to punch out with punches. There weren't things at the front that you had to unscrew with wrenches. You just pulled the trigger and pulled it apart, did your thing, slid it back together. So it brought a lot of innovation that, of course, now if you look at things like Walther and Smith & Wesson, a lot of companies have guns that are just as easy to take down. But at the time, that was fairly significant. One of the things it has, as you get into the later generations, it does have a single slot Picatinny rail, so that you can put lasers, lights, and various accessories on there. And you'll find that the grip is contoured on the Gen 4s along with a relatively aggressive stippling, but it's not painful. It doesn't bite into your hand, it doesn't hurt. And this is one of the things, if you look at the guns over the years, not a whole lot has changed on these guns. The significant things that have changed is some of the grip contours have changed through the generations. The textures have changed through the generations. In Gen 4 they introduced a reversible mag catch, so you can take it and flip it over and make it reversible. It is important to note, though, if you choose to reverse the mag catch, you have to have Gen 4 mags that have the dual cutouts. Cut out on each side. If you have the earlier mags, they won't work with the mag catch reversed, but the earlier mags will work if you leave the mag catch on the standard side, set up for a right-handed shooter. Other than that, it's just a simple, straightforward gun. Oh, one other thing I will mention, you do get interchangeable backstraps on the Gen 4, so that you can take these without a backstrap. It's roughly equivalent to the Gen 4 S or the Gen 3 SF or short frame. And then you can put additional backstraps on here to make it a little bit bigger, depending on the size of your hand and how you want your grip to be. It's a pleasure to shoot at the range. It's easy to shoot well. It's easy to get it back on target. It's a little bit heavy compared to some of the other guns like the Glock 19, but it's not an unacceptable weight. It weighs 22 ounces. But that does do excellent recoil management, especially in the 9mm. So overall, it's just a pleasure to shoot, and when you add that to it, some of the history of the gun, it really makes it a fun addition to your Glock or any other gun collection you might have. So hang on for some more range footage. If you like our videos, please give us a thumbs up, share, subscribe, and have a great day. Thank you.